Hi everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the semester's inaugural session in our fall 2024 event series, Law in Action. Welcome also to those who are rewatching this session at a later point in time. My name is Stati Shah. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a GSD candidate at Columbia Law School. I will be the moderator for this session. Before turning to today's brilliant speaker, Professor Chaumtoli, let me briefly introduce the Law Science Project. We are an academic initiative coordinated by a group of US doctoral candidates and early academics who are exploring different legal methodologies. Now, even within the group, we have differing approaches to research, but we all agree on the emphasis of methodology. If you want to learn more about the Law Science Project, please visit our website and join our email list, the links to which are posted in the chat box. I'm really excited to also introduce our project's coordinators, Madeline Hudge, GSD candidate from University of Virginia School of Law, Song Jun Chen, a GSD candidate at UIUC School of Law, Simon Sun, co-founder and assistant professor at National Yang Ming Chiao Tung University School of Law, Vanessa Villanueva, senior fellow and the chief editor of the Legal Method Lab, Patrick, the former coordinator and now a professor at the National Taiwan University. We also have representatives at several law schools in the US, such as UC Berkeley, UPenn, University of Illinois, University of Washington, Columbia, and Fordham. We also have Daniel join us, who's a senior fellow. If you are interested in getting involved, please do reach out to us, and we would love to onboard you as our law science representative. We also host a blog on legal methodology, the Legal Method Lab, for which we are always searching for editors. So if you're interested in becoming either of these, please do reach out to us. Okay, great. So Professor Huck is going to start us off with a presentation on the topic Critical Legal Research Methods, who is the scholar and redefining legal scholarship. Professor Huck is a leading expert on employment and labor law, migration, and human rights with a focus on social movements in the US and South Asia. She is also the founder editor of an innovative law and media nonprofit, Law at the Margins. Professor Huck has devoted her professional career to public service, focusing on issues impacting workers in the US and South Asia. Along with holding leadership roles at Legal Services of NYC and MFY Legal Services, she served as director of the first South Asian Workers' Rights Project at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and she was also the first staff attorney to the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. Her scholarship explores interrelated issues under the broad theme of transnational labor law and social movements, which include how law and social movements interact to create emancipatory visions of global labor and human rights laws. She has produced short documentaries related to her work in Bangladesh called Shramik Awaz, Workers' Voices, and has also created a digital archive of her work on tea workers in Bangladesh called Chai Justice. She is a 2019 Access to Justice Leadership Awardee by the South Asian Bar Association of New York, the 2020 Dana Public Interest Visiting Fellow awarded to nationally recognized public interest leaders. She was a 2023 Fulbright US Scholar in Malaga, Spain, and visiting scholar in Sicily researching South Asian migration to Europe. Before we start, please be reminded that we have time for Q&A at the end of Professor Huck's presentation, so please be prepared with your questions. The event will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. You can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and I will read them out on your behalf. But now, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Huck. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuti, for this invitation. And also very much thanks to the Law and Science group and Simon as a co-founder. I was very much thrilled to learn that there was this focus on research methods and, and just that there are scholars that are looking at sort of different ways of approaching their scholarship. So today, my goal is to present one way in which I've engaged in scholarship, the methods that I've sort of used. I sort of put that broadly in the category of critical research methods. And so I'll explain a little bit more about that. That's not to say that this are the sum total of methods that are out there. They may or may not directly relate to the scholarship that you're engaged in. So I hope that by providing some initial sort of background, that we will reserve some time for Q&A and a robust discussion, because I think this is really a valuable space, and I'm glad to see individuals engaged in this. So my goal is to first kind of lay out different ways in which past theoreticians have thought about what is the role of the scholar. And so one of the things I would like each of us to think about, and this is something that I had to kind of confront. I'm a late bloomer, I say, meaning that after almost over a decade of being a public interest lawyer for social movements, I then transitioned to academia. I also am a sort of a non-traditional scholar in the sense that I didn't go through the PhD route, but I soon began to realize that, and it sounds like very similar to what Simon described as the origin of this project, is, well, how do I do my work, and who am I, and who am I to do this work? And I think that those questions became very important to me early on in my scholarship, so much so that I really couldn't even engage in my own writing and publication until I sort of squared in my own mind these ideas. And so I wanted to sort of share that. So the kind of impetus behind this talk is really thinking through, what is my role now vis-a-vis knowledge production? And in terms of my scholarship, what kind of scholarship do I want to produce? Early on, one of my mentors, Professor Ann Cammett here at CUNY Law School, said to me, what kind of work do you want your work to do? Meaning, what kind of work do you want your scholarship to do? What impact do you want to make? And I'm not necessarily saying that all of our work has to be, necessarily producing this impact, but I think what her question sort of proposes to me is to be a little bit more intentional, thoughtful about who we are as scholars, our role, our positionality, and then also what are we producing in terms of knowledge, because the implications of our scholarship are actually immense, right? Right. So with this kind of grounding, so I'm going to go through some scholars who have thought about this, and if there are others, because this is something I'm writing on now, please do share. And then I'm going to share with you just, a couple of examples where I've tried to implement some of these ideas. Okay? So that's kind of my goal for today. So first, I want to talk about sort of a little bit of a different orientation. So I agree wholeheartedly with the mission of law and science, which is that most legal scholarship is mostly looking at sort of the traditional doctrinal analysis. You look at an area of law and you explain it, and maybe there's a policy implication, but there's really less empirical work, there's ethnographic work, there's less, even surveys, there's less kind of the multitude of research methods that others use in the humanities to answer a research question, right? We all start with a research question. And so legal scholars then answer that just by looking at the law. Now it's changed dramatically. I think that's really a positive sign. But still, it remains to be true that the dominant scholarship, it does not actually engage with different methods that other subjects do. So, but I want to sort of put a feminist caution on the methods that we import. So if we're bringing in these research methods, they have their own genealogy, they have their own ideology. So are they actually serving the role that you're trying to do in your scholarship? So I talk about, so there's a long area of scholarship of, a feminist looking at a critique, and I put science in quotes, right? Of science being that science has always been posited as something that dominates over nature. That is, that science, the study of nature, is by its sense sort of extractive. And Vandana Shiva, Maria Mies are feminists and ecofeminists that have been sort of bringing up this caution. And so one of the things I wanted to kind of, if the goal of the scholar is to understand, make meaning of our world, what Vandana Shiva says is that, look, so much of science is very much, even the scientific methodology, data-driven, rationality, right? Quantitative. These methodologies, right? If we only rely on those methodologies, is very much one-sided. It's looking at the issue from one vantage point. That's not to say inherently quantitative surveys, data-driven, are inherently extractive, but only looking at that methodology may produce extractive methods. So she writes that so much of science is one-sided, one-eyed. I want the knowledge on the whole. If you don't understand the whole, you don't see the patterns. If you don't understand interconnections, you really don't have knowledge. So if we're really, as scholars, if our job is knowledge production, then, and we want to actually make this whole, then I think we need to actually have diverse methodologies. And oftentimes I do utilize that in relationship to what what I'm studying at a particular moment. And I don't think, based on the description of law and science, is actually this kind of critique that Vandana Shiva is making, because I'm looking at your description, you're talking about diverse methodologies, opening up spaces, but this is just a caution of that when we import science, or we sort of say, well, scientific methods are somehow superior to other methodologies, that I think there is some caution in that, and that we may be replicating certain dynamics in our scholarship that we probably don't want to do. And I think I wanted to start off with that. So when I talk about research methods, I talk about it more from a different ways of knowing. So for me, it's about diverse epistemologies, right? How do we know what we know? So I locate my critical research methodologies in the scholarship of Black feminists, global South scholars, because each of them have confronted with the issue of being written about, studied, without their voices being included into that. So the way in which they're named, the way in which they're talked about, have always been extractive. So I think that we want to be careful about this. And for those of you who are interested, some of this sort of pushback around objective truth, rationalism and reason comes out of European Enlightenment, right? And this is part of for those of you familiar with critical race scholars, have also pushed back against this notion of this objective truth. So it is a particular type of science, right? That is European. That is not to say that scientific knowledge and methodologies in of itself are problematic, but I think we have to kind of name that and sort of distinguish ourselves from that. Okay, so so now I want to just talk just generally about the role of the scholar, and I'm going to present 3 different ways. There have some similarities, but I'm going to promote sort of a way in which that's been helping me, which is called the democratic scholar, and I'll come to that. Now, not all scholarship are movement oriented. So as I mentioned to you, my scholarship is focused on that. So this may have different relevance to depending on what your own work is. So this concept of scholar activism is an umbrella term. And basically what it says is that academic workers, right? And I talk of ourselves as workers, right? We're in the laboring of intellectual knowledge. We engage in intellectual labor, that they have a role to play. They're not like public intellectuals. Public intellectuals, which is the dominant model of the role of the scholar in the public sphere, is that they offer commentary on society, they make academic knowledge accessible and relevant. Extremely important. I'm not saying that that's not a role to play. Scholar activists go further. that it's not just simple about making the academic knowledge accessible, it's how is that knowledge produced? Who gets to produce it? Who gets a say in that knowledge is what the scholar activist is pushing against, right? So the scholar activist does not have to be based in an academic institution or formally trained. For example, some of you may know Grace Lee Boggs, and James Lee Boggs was a Black auto worker and kind of a community-based scholar and has written a lot. And so was not necessarily formally trained in higher education. So, but is producing information and knowledge about communities, right? The scholar activist understands the relationship between the academic to society and how knowledge gets produced. So that's the distinguishing factor. So now I want to introduce kind of my own sort of phrasing, which is probably more aligned with scholar activism, but I choose the phrase democratic scholar. In the bottom, I have kind of a preliminary where I was just thinking about this prior to academia. And the democratic scholar is similar to scholar activism, but it sort of challenges this notion. Scholar activism has this sort of like negative reputation. Oh, it's activist scholars. They're not real scholars. They kind of manipulate their information to like meet a social need. And what in democratic scholar, what I want to do to say, no, actually all scholarship isn't objective, right? There isn't this notion of that this sort of like objective truth. And so, but democratic scholar is doing something more that if we include diverse methodologies and we include multiple sort of narrators and producers of knowledge, scholarship then becomes democratic, right? That actually what we are producing is not produced by one individual, me, you, or because the scholar is the individual scholar that kind of produces, right? And so democratic scholarship for me, and this is my phrasing, is employs methodologies that actively engages and invites the participation of people and community impacted by the scholarship, gives them a voice in the direction, production of such ideas, and where appropriate to provide shared ownership, attribution of the contributions and the promotion of ideas, right? They have to be interested in disrupting individual notions of all scholarship. We have to admit that our ideas don't just kind of come into my head in a vacuum, which is why for some of you, for your PhD, you have to actually note down the literature review is sort of similar to that, right? I mean, we do a little bit of this within our scholarship, like whose work are you drawing from? But oftentimes we draw from other scholars, but we don't actually acknowledge that we might have talked to a community-based organization. We might have talked to an organizer, and we never really attribute those persons in our scholarship. So think about, how do you know what you know? How did you come to know what you know? And it's not simply just by reading theoreticians. There must be other ways in which you come to your knowledge, and to kind of really democratize that process. For me, to be truly democratic, it has to be anti-imperial and anti-colonialist, because the whole nature of this sort of individualized scholarship is extractive. I go in, research a community, take what I want, and then the raw material, and then I come back and I produce, and then I become the expert, right? So we'll come back to this. So I want to sort of propose democratic scholarship as the mode by which we actually truly doing what we say that we're doing, which is presenting a research question and answering that research question in the most pluralist, democratic way possible, whereby we as a scholar are just simply facilitating this knowledge production. We're not necessarily controlling the narrative or controlling the production of it. So it's really about sharing, right? It's about sharing, removing the individual scholar as the kind of sole narrator of our scholarship. So I'm going to go quickly through how did I come to some of these ideas. I just said to you, my ideas don't just come out of a vacuum. They come from looking at other scholars. So I think that, and there may be others, but so these are a few that I'm just going to whisk through, who have thought a little bit about their role. and the role of intellectuals in society, and a little bit about knowledge production. And so based on some of these ideologies, I come to this notion of the democratic scholar. So I think and there may be others. So I think the most sort of notable figure is Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who talks about this idea in the Prison Notebook about organic intellectuals, right? And he distinguishes organic intellectuals. He doesn't use that phrase. This is the quote: all men are intellectuals, one could therefore say. Meaning all of us are thinking beings, right? We all have brains, we all can understand and make meaning of our world. So it's not that like I'm now a professor of law at CUNY. There's nothing particularly special about me except I have a title. And that title gives me a established position in society. However, there are other individuals that also opine and think about ideas. And so he talks about this idea of organic intellectuals, individuals that come from the community, and not just anyone, things who are thinking about these issues. And so all men are intellectuals, but not all men have in society the function of intellectuals. So all of us here are striving for that functionality of intellectuals, but actually this is a democratic project, right? This is a project that all individuals can participate in. So Gramsci is one kind of idea of this organic intellectual, right? So the idea that ideas can come from a vast constituency, and it doesn't only resort to those in academia who control, right? What is scholarship? What isn't scholarship? Walter Rodney is a intellectual and professor. He's a Guyanese sort of intellectual who has written about colonialism in Africa. And he talks about, in Groundings with My Brother, the role of the intellectual. And he says that the role of the intellectual should be to aspire, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, and I'll share this PowerPoint. The role of the intellectual should be not just to remain in the academia, but to be out there, to go out into the world and to engage with the community. And so for Rodney, the Black intellectual doesn't hide in the university, right? But actually proactively challenges the status quo within academia. And in many ways, what you are doing in your project is a similar, right, challenge of the status quo. The way in which knowledge is produced, you're saying, as from your law and science group, that there's a different way to do this. And so in doing that, we are challenging kind of what gets produced and how it gets produced, right? So Gramsci's organic intellectual, Rodney's idea of that you as the intellectual in academia should be disrupting these established notions of how we know. So knowledge production simply is, how do we know what we know? I mean, just to kind of break it down, we can use words like epistemology, we can use like hegemony, we can use all these words, but it essentially is, how do we make meaning of the world? And who gets to say that? Who gets that authority, the final say? So Toni Cadwell-Bambara is a Black feminist so part of our role as scholars is to write, right? And in some ways, those who write and publish determine how a subject is treated. And so one of the reasons for going into academia, I found that I was reading materials in academia, and I was like, I've heard community members say this, but they're not attributed in the scholar's work. And they're presenting it as if this is something totally new. So writing has this power of domination because you can actually determine how a subject is narrated and told and understood. And so Toni Cadwell-Bambara kind of sort of talks about, hey, the writer's task is to bear witness. And it's a legitimate way to participate in the society because what is written about me, right, as a Black woman, is going to be taken as true. And so because what we write, the knowledge, the scholarship that we produce actually has direct impact on communities and ability of individuals to name themselves, define themselves, I think that we have then this greater responsibility as scholars, right? We can't do our work just oh, this is the way I'm going to do it, and this is what I think. Because once we think it and write it, it has these great repercussions. And so I think all of these scholars are saying that you can't do your work just by sitting and, just sort of like, I'm going to look at this law and that's it. And that we do need to then integrate different methods, right? All right. So again, adding on to why, right? Why do we look at alternative research methods? So Spivak in the Subalterns Can Speak says, no, well, the way that the current society and system is structured, marginalized communities cannot speak. So the answer to Spivak, right, is can a subaltern speak? No. And in the legal system, it's so stark, right? Because if you go to court, who can speak? Only the lawyer can speak, right? Your client can't even speak. You speak for them. So if you think about like in our profession, how often we are in the role of speaking for others. So he talks about this idea of epistemic violence, which is that the violence, not physical, the violence of ideas, that when certain ideas, and this is very similar to Tony Bambara's, is that once I am named, right, that and that whether it's third world, global south, once I am named, that certain meaning is created, and my ability to be able to challenge those meanings, ability to kind of to question that, become limited. This is what she calls sort of this epistemic violence, right? That we create these categories of other. I am the scholar, and then you're the person I'm researching, right? These binaries then get created. So all of these scholars are kind of grappling from different angles. This like one, who is the scholar, what's their role? And then here, Spivak is talking about, well, if we don't want this epistemic violence, then how do we undo it? How do we challenge this, right? How do we create a form of scholarship where the subaltern can speak? Is it possible even, right? All right. So again, if you see a pattern, it's not surprising that the scholars who have been thinking about these issues have been scholars from the global South, have been Black feminists, have been, I would say, in Gramsci's case, sort of left-oriented. Why? Because they're having to deal with dominant systems of knowledge production that have marginalized communities that have been and have disempowered communities. So what bell hooks adds into this sort of like, and again, I don't mean to reify individuals, right? Because I've just talked about collectivizing knowledge, but the thing is that these are individuals who are speaking up and challenging these ideas of who the scholar is, what is scholarship. And what bell hooks is saying, it's not enough to just sort of write about this, right? So to build community requires vigilant awareness, and that there's a body of critical theory that's available now to challenge white supremacist thought and racism, right? But explanations alone do not bring us to the practice of the beloved community. It's not enough just to even if you have the sort of inclusive methodologies, that's just not enough. You have to bring it back to the community. It has to be in what I call a dialogic, like in dialogue with the communities or with the issues that you are writing about, right? Now, caveat, I started with that this is kind of the Democratic scholar activist. It may or may not be relevant to your particular inquiry, but I would be interested to learn, to hear that in the Q&A. I'm looking at a particular mode of scholarship that has been burgeoning, right? Which is to look at the communities, social movements. And even in those scholarship, the scholar is the sole narrator. They're not bringing in these alternate perspectives. All right. And then the last person is Patricia Collins, who talks about intersectionality, right? So that oppressed groups are constantly named, defined, not by themselves, right, by others, and that they're framed in relationship to a dominant group or dominant ideology. And so what she talks about as a scholar is that we have to elevate and challenge these ideas against the dominant groups, right? So just to kind of recap, I've just pulled just some ideas that to kind of map out that there is a body of literature that has been attending to challenging the way in which we produce knowledge in scholarship. And interestingly enough, none of these are legal scholars, right? I mean, that says why your project is so important, that this is this vibrant debate. And these are scholars from the 60s and 70s. I'm not talking about like, oh, just a new thing in the humanities. Uh, and so we are seeing now legal scholars kind of going back to some of these theoreticians, but where I kind of would push further is, and I want to now turn to the different methods in our work, is that it's okay to bring in perspectives and talk about marginalized communities, but how do you do that work and how do you bring the sort of different voices is something that I think about a lot. So when I was beginning to start my scholarship, I felt kind of like a pause, like, who am I to talk about this group? Right? And how can I talk about this group? I don't share, even though, for example, my work in Bangladesh, like someone would say, well, you're Bangladeshi and you can talk about it. No, because my lived experience, particularly as a law professor, is drastically different than the population that I'm looking at, which are workers, marginalized communities, indigenous communities, right? So already I have to be aware of my positionality, right? Even if I can speak the language and share some commonality as culture. And so I don't have time to talk about that, but Spivak talks a lot about the the kind of the kind of middle class, upper middle class intellectuals in global North universities, kind of the third world, who are educated in elite institutions and are remain in elite institutions, and then present themselves as representing certain groups, but actually reflect a class positioning, right? And so, and I can, if those of you are interested, I can, share the site. And she's critical of that, and that's why she's never used like women of color or third woman, because she's like, I come from India from a particular class background, and so when I'm in the US, I am under a racial paradigm of subjugation as a brown woman. However, I still have certain privileges by virtue of my class. And so she's very much attuned to the role of the scholar of color, who is in the global North. And I very much kind of agree with that. All right, so research methodologies. So I'm going to go through this quickly just so that we have time for Q&A. And if anyone has specific questions, so kind of laying out different conceptions of scholars, different ways that we should be actually upending the ways that we do things. So critical methodologies, what it does is think about your power relationship between you, the researcher, and the participant, the ethics, right? If you, and some of you, if you do this work, you might have go through your IRB in your institution. Is my research going to make this population more vulnerable? I have to gone through this when I was doing research in Europe with migrant workers, undocumented workers, right? What's your positionality and the participant? And think about the different methods. So there's a whole host of methods, right? There could be participant observation, there could be surveys, there could be what's called semi-structured interviews, which are more qualitative. You can do, you can look at quantitative, you can, my research methodologies tended to, because I'm looking at communities that haven't often been sort of, written about or talked about, have used predominantly the semi-structured interviews and have used, some limited sort of look at existing databases that exist in like recording this population, but only to the extent of like data, like how many Bangladeshis are there in Spain? Well, come to find out, in Spain, their official tally is like 12,000. But if you go to the community, they're like, we have 60,000. Like, whoa, how? So I was like fascinated. How could there be 12 to 60,000? Well, then as a researcher, I know that, well, not all undocumented immigrants are going to actually be registered. Well, what's their registration system? So when we are using existing data, you want to look at how do they come across that data, right? How is that data sort of recorded? Because there are going to be biases. It's like input, output, right? There's going to be biases within that data. So participant observation. And the last is something that I'm exploring with, I'm just going to mention, is this idea of visual ethnography, where oftentimes it's about interviews saying something about oneself, but oftentimes communities represent themselves in cultural ways and other ways that are not expressed in words, right? And so can we get a sense of how communities are, to get this, remember back to Vandana Shiva's idea of knowledge as whole, can we get a sense of kind of an issue just by how they visually represent themselves? Like, how are communities representing themselves? And I've looked at like movies, cinemas, like how does the dominant group represent a particular community, and has the community itself represented itself? And it's really interesting, like a movie in Spain, for example, on my migrant worker research, they can't tell the difference between Muslim South Asians or Indian South Asians. It's like everyone in Spanish of the world is Hindu, right? So they're like, well, they're all Indian. But then we're like, well, no, there's lots of variations. But you'll see like this movie about this a Spanish guy who falls in love with a Bangladeshi girl, but they have like, she's Bangladeshi Muslim, but they have all these imageries of like more from Hinduism. And it just shows you that the dominant group really has no idea of this kind of community, just as an illustration. All right, so I'm going to go through, and I'm sorry, because I do want to get to some questions, is different examples of how I've combined my scholarship with kind of integrating kind of community voices. And I will say as a self-critique that even in doing these methodologies, it still is, I'm still kind of controlling the research and the direction of it, right? So as a kind of a self-critique, and I want to move towards a more co-created, collaborative models of research. Some examples are participation action research models, but some of those things, do take time to develop, to build trust with whoever you're working with. So in 2013 to 2014, I was in Bangladesh after the Rana Plaza building collapsed, and this was a building that produced garments for global brands. And immediately after, the world community came together to create this kind of safety accord, which is to monitor the building and structural safety of buildings. And it was heralded in the like labor movement as like the best thing. And so I took my academic fellowship and I went to Bangladesh and I said, let me go and see, well, this is supposed to help workers. Well, let me interview workers and see what do they think. Well, short end of it is they had no idea, right? So all of this grand sort of like, and it is one of, so those of you who do international law, the Bangladesh Safety Accord is a private agreement between unions and other stakeholders to adhere to certain standards. And that's been kind of a trend within the labor law field of global framework agreements. And I've written about this as well. And so what I began to find out is that a lot of the workers were not aware. If they were aware, it was through organizing. And so then I kind of paused and I worked with the filmmaker. Well, I wanted to, well, what are their issues? Like, it seemed like this accord, I'm not saying that the accord should not be, we shouldn't have international agreements, we shouldn't have these, but it's not actually reaching the people that are most impacted, and that's not their demand, right? So the scholarship should be led by the demands of those impacted. And what came from it was then this documentary. I worked with a filmmaker, and I'm happy to share with you the full length documentary. And what came from it was actually nothing about the accord, but two things. One is we need to increase our wages, and we need increased unionization. Because if we were unionized, then we would be able to advocate for ourselves. So we have then this model of a legal, this international agreement that essentially disempowers and doesn't empower the workers at the plant floor. And so that's part of a little bit of the transnational labor work that I do. So now, I'm not saying for you to be filmmakers. I'm not telling you for you to like go, but I think I'm just to illustrate that, you know, to not start with the assumption. If I just started with the accord, say, kind of why your project is so important. If I did a doctrinal analysis of just the accord, I was like, great, this sounds great. It's how buildings should be safe. And in fact, most of the scholarship has been that, like, accord is great. It's the first of its kind to like bind corporations because business and human rights are not enforceable. But it misses a key point, which is it really helping those it's supposed to impact? And so I wrote an article. So from that research, I wrote an article, Opportunities and Limitations uh, of the Accord, and talking about how worker organizing needs to be a part of it. So you see how just by interviewing, doing the semi-structured interviews of workers, and there I did individuals, I interviewed stakeholders like unions, I interviewed government officials. And so by doing this sort of like research, this interview-based methodology, I actually came to a different conclusion that while it's helpful, it actually doesn't get to the issues that workers care about. Okay. So I'm gonna just want to be, it's 15 minutes here. So I'm gonna go through another similar example is tea workers, where I wrote an article on this land grab movement, and I interviewed 9 women who are leaders of the movement. And one of the things with as a researcher is like once I research it, I include it into my law review article. And it was a very interesting because they were like, how do you cite to like Blue Book, right? The Blue Book is actually not clear. I mean, something that's so banal, right? Like you're just like, you do this like grand research. You're like, okay, how do you then cite to people? And people were like, well, how do we know they said what they said? And I was like, well, they said what they said, right? Like oral testimony and what people say is actually truth. But we have such a distrust of people in our legal system that if it's not proven. So then anyway, I was like, well, I wanted these interviews to be available. So I subtitled, collated the interviews, worked with a video editor, and it's available on Chai Justice. So that what has now happened is people can read my article, sure, but people can also just listen to directly the workers. They don't have to take my article. I mean, my article is going to be different just because the nature of law journals and what have you. But the writing is different, but there is this other source that is public. So that basically I am not the sole narrator of this movement. And that by creating my law review article alongside this digital archive, my attempt is to put us both as co-equals as narrators of this particular issue, right? So law at the margins, I work with Chandra Delaney. This is sort of not outside of this, academia. And her son was someone who had been brutalized under solitary confinement, and sadly, after was released, was killed because he's going back to communities that are also unsafe. So she did this whole series with me at Law at the Margins called Movement Talks. And so here, she selected who she would interview, and then I would work with her as an editor to then create these small kind of videos and really short kind of text. And it was then posted on Instagram. And so here is an example of supporting a knowledge producer. So it's like Law at the Margins becomes this kind of space that this non-academic knowledge producers can then be cultivated. And that's partly what my goal for Law at the Margins is that those who are most impacted by law to be narrators of the law, to tell us about the law. So if you can go to Instagram, Law at the Margins, and these are a series of what she's done. She's gone to different human rights and all in the field of the criminal justice system, interview them. And these are just These are the kind of everyday people who are in the work, they're thinking about the work, but no one has ever asked them about, what do you think about a particular issue, right? So, and this kind of same idea of like co-collaborators. So in 2023, I spent 6 months in Spain on a Fulbright scholarship looking at sort of Bangladeshi migrants. Now, how do I get access to this community? And so I worked very closely with Mohammed, sorry, it's a little blurry, but Mohammed Elahi Alam. And so he is the director of this new organization that serves immigrants, but particularly Bangladeshi immigrants. So when I came back to the US, I was invited, of course, to talk about my scholarship. They're like, "Oh, you were in Fulbright. Can you talk about it?" And I said, "No, I want to present with Muhammad Ali together." So he then presented the portion about the community because everything that I learned about the community was him as in research methodology, we talk of them as the kind of like the trusted source, right? So instead of like kind of putting him low as like, oh, he's my trusted source, community impact, that he's actually a very active, visible role in like creating this scholarship. So he presented about the community, and then I then made my sort of assessment, which is this paper, which is I'm working on this semester and next is how is it a small community like in Spain has been able to make some really dramatic changes in immigration law in Spain? And what can we learn from this community organizing? So this is another example of how to bring in the people that you're drawing your knowledge from. And I'm going to end here. So I was talking to you about visual ethnography, right? And so I don't think if I can't do this. So what I was thinking about is like, these are two migrants that, this is in both in Malaga in a restaurant that I went several times. And so the person who's looking out into the water is someone that went from India to North Africa through circuitous routes and then took the Mediterranean by boat to come to Spain. Now, the majority of the workers there are male. And so if you can imagine, I'm this female. I'm also not non-traditionally dressed. I have like short hair. They were already kind of like, why did you come from America to do this research? Like, why do you care? What are you going to do with this information? And so what I found was that, and then because they are majority male, they would just say, oh, I did this. I went to Algeria, Morocco, and I came to Spain. And then I was like, oh, wait, I just lost like a whole body of information of like, what was it like? And so at one point in the interview, the person said he said to me, he was standing in the restaurant, right, sitting in the restaurant rather, in one of this middle picture, and he gestured. So if you look out, that's the same water, right? And he said, I came from there. And then I was sort of like, okay, what do you mean you came from there? I said, I came from there. And then he didn't want to talk anything further. Like clearly that, and he said, in the 2 years that I came to Spain, and Malaga is like beach, like coastal, I've never been able to sit on the beach. And so what I realized was that like there was things that I couldn't capture just through a traditional semi-structured interview. And probably given the gender dynamics that he wouldn't probably share because it's not natural to share emotions, right? Like socialization and what have you. But by having both of them sort of gesture towards and elaborate on something external, right? So instead of talking about, was it traumatizing for you? Yes, is tell me about what it was like. So then this picture is him sort of looking at, right? Now, that's not the exact point in which he's entering into southern Spain. But my point being is through visual ethnography is that there are things that cannot be said, that we can't capture, but it really gets us a sense of like the community, right? That can be used through sort of these visual cues. And so like markers of like allowing the individual to talk about that aren't doesn't force them to re-traumatize themselves, but also get to the kind of the emotional part of, of this work. So this is my last example. I'm gonna pause there. I know that it was a lot, but I wanted to, so if you see it's now going, what I began to do is create this collage of visuals, and then I would share that, it's just a minute, and I would share that with individuals and interviewing, and just have them remark on that. So something externalized. It's useful if you're working with a population that extremely traumatized. So for example, oftentimes a lot of the migrants would say, why did they pick Malaga? They were like, oh, it reminds them of home. And there was a picture of a tree, a banyan tree, and this particular palm tree, right, is very common in southern coastal Bangladesh. So by using these common sort of imageries, I was able to also get individuals to open up. So I'm going to pause there just to kind of, because we're close to time, is so kind of the takeaway really is, just one is think about what kind of scholar do you want to be? Because all of this came about because I was trying to answer that question. What kind of scholar do I want to be? What do I want my scholarship to do? What work do I want it to do? Going back to Tony Kadambara's and the writing, right? And bell hooks, the idea of taking it into action. And in terms of methods, once I decided that, I wanted individuals who I'm writing about to be as involved and as visible in my scholarship as is possible. Now, we didn't talk about the constraints of academia, tenure, da 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 da. You're supposed to have like original writing, and no one's supposed to contribute to it. Everything I'm saying goes against the structures of academy. And so I know that it's hard to navigate, and I'm happy to talk about that. But that was the impetus for how I then began to conduct my work. All right, so I'm gonna stop share.
This was such a powerful and timely presentation. Thank you, Professor. We've
Mhm.
entered the Q&A session. Again, the event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments, you can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and I'm happy to read them on your behalf. I think Daniel, you had a question?
Yeah, sure. I can start us off. First of all, thanks. I love the presentation. I think that the role of the researcher is something we normally don't discuss. So our own positionality and how the knowledge that we try to produce is really produced. So I love the presentation. I have two conceptual questions.
Yeah.
It maybe kind of push back against what you said, but I just want to hear your thoughts on this. So
Yeah,
in your
absolutely.
notion of democratic scholarship, I was wondering what's the role of theory in there? So it seems to me that you must have some form of theoretical priors for
Yes.
concluding that democratic scholarship is the way to go.
Right.
And these theoretical priors, whatever they may they be Marx or Gramsci or whatever, they are themselves also, some kind of perceptions of the truth that were produced not through a democratic scholarship itself, but through a certain kind of, so they weren't produced through dialogue, but through more like traditional kind of ways of theory producing. That's the first question. And the second one is, a lot of critical theorists, I think, would argue that perception is in some way determined, or at least shaped by hegemonic ideology or some kind of economic base, or whatever your preferred framing is. If that's the case, why would we think there's truth in democracy? So in democratic ways of producing truth, and why do we think there's truth even in the knowledge or the perception of specific marginalized groups or specific activists?
Very good. These are great questions, actually, and they actually go to the importance of having a diverse methodologies so I'll deal with the second first. So that, yes, because critical theorists are challenging hegemonic or sort of dominant notions of dominant ideas, then how, in critical race scholars, right, also challenge this idea that there's this one essentialist truth. I'm not reifying that, here are these tea workers and therefore they know everything about the land movement, right? So that in our, when you design a research project, you want to have multiple viewpoints on the issue, and that it is in this contestation of these different viewpoints that even amongst the different tea workers, male versus female, you're going to get a much more richer and oftentimes contradictory view. So so for me, the democracy, yes, it itself is a contested, right? We assume, for example, United States, the democracy is electoral. When I'm using it as more kind of in a broader sense of like pluralism of ideas. And so for me, I completely agree with you. And so that's why as a scholar, it's very important to your, for IRB or in your PhD, like how have you designed your research methods, right? So for me, it's making sure I'm talking to multiple stakeholders. For example, my interview of the union is very different than the individual workers. And in fact, there is a tension, and that sometimes creates some conflict because how do I then present those? So I just surface these tensions, right? And one tension that came up in the interview was that this was a land grab, and the prime minister, who's now fled Bangladesh, it grabbed the land, but the tea workers are loyal to this particular prime minister. So I was like, well, how do you think you're going to get justice if, and so then it was also kind of a little bit of pushing on, being okay to push on the questioning. And the workers then were like, well, we didn't know. We didn't know that actually she was responsible for the, so part of it is then designing kind of the research. So not falling back into essentialist or that there's one truth, but the scholars laying bare. And then, of course, you then, through your own, and this gets to our first question, through your own orientation, would theorize to understand and make meaning of it. So when I think about theory, I think about theory very differently. I think about sort of what bell hooks talks about theory is essentially making meaning of the world. That's all it is. We complicate. Now, there are formal theoreticians, of course. I'm influenced by Gramsci, Marxism, and left theoreticians for sure. That is because even though they have done, as you said, like not done this sort of diverse research methodologies, what they are doing is trying to make sense of the world and alternative explanations of the world. And so as a scholar, I want to draw from that, but I don't end with those scholars, right? And so for me, I think in terms of where I draw from, would be global South, Black feminist scholars who, because of their social location in our society, oftentimes, right? So when talk about this from margin to center, bell hooks, Combahee River Collective is not like an essentialist position, like just because they're Black women, they have some special magic, vision, but because they are historically, politically, economically subjugated, have a positionality in looking at society that is worth sort of considering. So the way that they approach issues is going to be important. So I hope that is helpful. So when I'm conceiving the democratic scholar, that's like my own coinage, right? Isn't using kind of what there are democracies plural, right? It's not using the same kind of idea of like there's this one way and I'm kind of just I'm just replacing one modality from another modality. So I hope that is clear. So in a sense, I agree with all the two positions. I don't think it's a pushback, as positionality is important. And for each of you, designing and thinking through your research methods is really important. Is a particular method going to answer or get to your research question? So start with, what is your research question? What is the body of knowledge that you need to engage with? Is it folks who've written before literature review? Is it going to be a survey? Is it going to be like interview based? Is it going to be like, do that pre-work early, right? Before you sort of, and you have to, because if you are going to do any work in the community through your IRB, you have to do that.
Thank you, Professor Huck. Unfortunately, we've run out
Yeah.
of time, but I do want to acknowledge Tracy Bing's question and comment in the chat. How has your scholarship approach been received in the academic community? It is groundbreaking and community building. Would you like to quickly respond to this, Professor Huck?
I'll just say that for those of you who are early scholars, is that it well, I think here, thank you for acknowledging it, but it's very hard. You're going against, so for example, for me to write one article on the tea workers, I had to go back in the summer, do the interviews. I had to then transcribe that. The norm in legal academia is that you write 1 or 2 articles a year. And if you're not publishing every year, then you're not actually being productive. But if you're doing this kind of, integrating different methods into your work, then it's just not possible unless there's like, support and resources to do that. So one article that might have that someone else might just, push out 2 law review articles, mine will take 2 years to do. And so it's slow. And then our tenure clock is 6 years, 6 to 7 years. And you're supposed to produce a certain number of articles. So part of me doing this is to challenge, and I talk about it with my colleagues, is to like say what I'm doing and why this is important, so that scholars that come after me who want to do this methodologies or integrate different research methods into their work don't face that problem, that even if in the 4 years you produce 2 articles, or or to do a book, right? So now I'm starting on a book project that will take me several years, like, and people, I think this notion of like productivity is still in academia. Legal academia doesn't understand, like, why do you have to interview people? Why do you have to go to Spain? Like, I think that there's a longer conversation. I mean, knock on wood, I got tenure. I think it's because I'm at CUNY. I dare say if I was at Columbia, I don't think I would get tenure. I don't think that this kind of work or other elite legal institutions, they don't understand the work that I'm doing. Why are you going and talking to people? Why can't you just write about this? And for me, it's just personal and political in the sense of like, I don't think you can ethically do this work without involving individuals that are impacted by your work. I could not do this work otherwise. So if like, I resigned myself to deal with whatever repercussions. So thankfully at CUNY, they were very supportive, and Judge Bing is one of my colleagues, and she's here. So you can see the receipt, but I don't think CUNY is the norm. But if any of you want to talk offline about being strategic about this and how do you talk about it in a way that sounds like good to your tenure people, I'm happy to do that, because I have had to make the case make myself legible, right? To like, why is my work important to like those who review my scholarship? So I think it's a big issue. I don't want to romanticize it. It is, the structure of academia is still legal academia, and each of you, law and science came about because of that, right? Because you want to challenge that way of doing legal scholarship.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was really insightful, especially for most of us who are early career scholars. You've given us so much to think about. Before we let you all go, could you please turn on your camera so we can just take a quick picture together?
Oh, nice.
All right, thank you, Stuti. I think, yeah, please turn on the camera and just take a quick picture for social media. All right, 1, 2, 3. All right, let's do another one. Wait a second. 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Thank you, Stuti.
Yeah, thank you. Our next session of the series, Law in Action, will be in less than a month. on 21st October with Professor Kelly Orion. Hope to see you all there, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great day. Thank you.